A villain from the past gets resurrected. Here's your look at the Mattel Master of the Universe Origins Skeletor, the evil Lord of Destruction. Modernizing and celebrating the original 80s Master of the Universe action figures, Master of the Universe Origins gives you the power to pose Eternia's greatest warriors as retro-style figures or in a new action-packed battle positions. You know, I almost feel like we're stuck in a bit of a time warp as well when you think of all these retro toy lines that are now coming back in a big way. Ghostbusters, Thundercats, He-Man, and of course we've just recently been announced that we're going to be getting Silverhawks figures from the folks over at Super 7. It is certainly a good time to be an 80s toy fan. As we continue our looks at the Master of the Universe Origin figures, this time for Skeletor, I've decided to straighten out his legs. When we did have a look at He-Man first, I had the legs more bent in that retro pose. But I think for Skeletor, I'm going to straighten out his legs, and I'll get the measurements going for him that way. Stop the tape measure right at the very top of his head like that. And according to the readout, Skeletor from the Masters of the Universe Origins line, yes, admittingly a little behind on having a look at them. The figure stands, though, 5.9 inches in height. Switching that to centimeters, revealing that Skeletor is 15.1 centimeters tall. Like with the He-Man that we had a look at, I'd like to thank viewer Sherwin, who had picked these ones up for me so I could actually have a look at them, because up to this point, finding Master of the Universe Origins figures has been next to impossible, short of me, of course, going online and paying extra prices to get these. But Sherwin was very nice to go out of his way and pick these ones up. If you would like to check out his photography page over on Instagram, Shell Pose, I'll provide the link down below in the video description. Hey, now speaking of He-Man, I did after all mention the He-Man that we looked at before, so let's move on over Skeletor. Move on him down the road. Let's bring in He-Man that we had a look at previously. Get his feet to straighten up. Now, He-Man is a little bit more posed for battle, being that I already have the shield and the power sword in his hand. But to kind of give you guys an idea of how the figures stack up with one another, like with the vintage line, both Skeletor and He-Man, and you got to assume the rest of the Master Universe line, at least of the male persuasion, probably are all using the exact same bodies. And again, there's nothing wrong with that at all. Again, they proportionally do stack up well with one another. I could say that perhaps Skeletor is just slightly taller, and that's only because of the hood that's over top of his skull face. Having a look at Skelly's accessories, he does come included with the same mini comic that we got included with He-Man, so they haven't changed anything here at all. However, flipping it around, whoosh, this comic isn't ripped. I was able to actually take it out of its plastic prison unscathed. There's no single rip anywhere to be found on the back of this. This is what you would consider pristine. As a side story, I remember going to a local toy show several years ago, and somebody was selling a box of the entire Master of the Universe vintage mini comics. I think at the time that they were selling them, it was probably like $20. And I had passed on that. That is a regret I have still to this day. Just want to show you guys the comic on the inside, though. Unfortunately, the comic is exactly the same. The illustration's the same, the story's the same, and the outcome, you gotta believe, being that it's the same comic, basically wraps up shop the exact same way as well. I don't know if it's the case where every single Masters release is going to come with the same mini comic, or perhaps what they may do is the first wave may have all the same mini comic, and then maybe the second wave, which I don't have yet, may actually have a different variation to the mini comic. You gotta hope at least that Mattel would go that extra mile and not simply just give us the exact same mini comic with every single figure release. With that being said, let's put that to the side. Skeletor also comes included with one half, the other half of a power sword sandwich. Much like the original vintage line, if you had collected both He-Man and Skeletor. For me, myself, I remember for my birthday, I got both He-Man with the Battle Cat 2-pack, and I got the exact same thing with Skeletor and Panther, so that was really cool. In fact, I actually had both the beasts come included with the figures. But if you did have those vintage figures, you'd essentially be getting yourself one half of the power sword, which then is supposed to be taking the other half of the power sword, which is just so happened to have conveniently placed to the side by the black hole of mine, the other half of He-Man's power sword. And all you're basically just going to do is you're going to take the pegs to the one side and you're going to fit them into the holes on the other side. Couldn't be any bit easier than that. The downside, unfortunately, as you probably already see, is when you sandwich the two halves together, unfortunately it does leave a bit of a gap. One of the swords, both of the swords likely are probably just too warped. I think they could have probably added even a third peg down further below, just so that the blades would have actually touched to one another, and that the sword would have actually stayed better close together. If you are curious, though, with the two swords together, let's just say Skeletor has finally possessed the full completed power sword, and with that, the powers of Castle Grayskull. You can actually take both halves of the sword, put them together to form a delicious sandwich, and then from there you can actually put the sword in the hand of either Skeletor or He-Man. Would I still have liked to have included an actual full power sword? Absolutely. But at least, if you're going to be basing it from the original vintage toy line, it does make some sense that Mattel would have gone the route of giving you two halves instead of one whole. With that being said, we're going to take the power sword out of his hand. We'll just put the figure down for 1 second. Skeletor has some difficulty standing simply just because he has really tiny little feet. I didn't want to draw too much attention to it, but he has really, really tiny feet. You can take the power sword, though, mentioning nothing about Skeletor's tiny little feet. I suppose technically, like He-Man, you could kind of fit it to the back. One of the biggest problems with Skeletor is the thing that's currently happening right now. Now, He-Man did have some issue where the latch on the back of his armor really had a difficult time of staying in place. Skeletor takes that and extends that by maximum 10, because it really does have some difficulty getting these two peg points, this little peg, and the loop that's supposed to fit around it, really don't stay well together at all. You may even see over the course of this review me doing this, but even when the short amount of time, and I can't even stress this enough, the short amount of time that stays latched like this, you'll see soon enough, the moment I start touching this figure, that's going to come loose. Thank goodness at least he's got these strapped in, harnessed on either side of it, because if not for that, there would be very little actually holding the armor in place on Skeletor. Despite that, he also comes included with, of course, one other accessory. We'll put the figure down for a second, and that is of the trusty Havoc staff. What a glorious sight the Havoc staff is. I would love to get myself a 1-to-1 version of the power staff, although I think it would be a little bit too big for my living room. I've always liked the design of this particular Havoc staff. Slightly smaller snout, you can see on the skull here of the ram. It is a little bit smaller than what I would have thought it would have been. But again, it's a nice recreation of the original Havoc staff. Sort of Mattel's own take on the Havoc staff that the original Masters Skeletor had. It's a fairly long staff as well. It does fit into his hand, but unfortunately, because he's using the same body as He-Man, he only really had the necessary means to hold the staff in one hand. The other hand, being completely flat, is more so just for commanding his troops, or scolding them, certainly when they've failed his missions. I guess if you had yourself a shield, you probably could put that into Skeletor's forearm as well, or hey, you can even just rip off He-Man's. Skeletor does like to do a lot of stealing and thievery. You probably could just steal He-Man's shield and, of course, just put that onto his arm. So those are the accessories that come included with one Skeletor. We'll just move his Havoc staff to the side for the time being. And getting a closer look at this figure that you probably have seen countless times on store shelves. While unfortunately this humble Canadian reviewer has found squat in the way of Masters of the Universe Classics figures, again, thank you to Sherwin for picking these up for me, apparently Skeletor is just riddled across all the pegs in many U.S. Walmarts and other stores. For some strange reason, I guess for maybe Mattel ended up putting more Skeletors per case. So when people, of course, were buying up all the other Masters figures, it left poor Skeletor left behind, and in multiple quantities. Of course, this is the first time I've actually seen Skeletor physically in hand, because all the other Walmarts I've tried, maybe now 5, possibly even now 6 Walmarts, because I did try one that was a little more out of my area, and still nothing stocked in the way of Masters figures. Short of me doing that little bit of tyrant, we'll put that to the side for the time being. Let's talk a little bit about Skeletor. Now again, when you compare the two, just bringing in He-Man here so you can see the two side to side. Same body, like with the original vintage line. The arms, the forearms, the biceps, the shoulders, the torso, and lower legs are all identical, complete as well with that fur loincloth. Now, of course, Skeletor's is covered over with his own version of a loincloth, kind of like an armor cloth piece there. But other than that, I mean, it's basically the exact same figure when you look at them side to side. And that's really the way it should be anyways. I can't imagine that this line should ever be a case where you're using unique molds from one figure to the other. When we did get the 2000 series Masters of the Universe figures, of course, that line gave us different designs and different builds to those characters. But if you want to go back to the original 80s line, the 80s line was all about reusing the same molds. And Skeletor here, again, is just reusing the mold that we've gotten already with He-Man. Now, honestly speaking, I really didn't like the look of He-Man. I'm still sort of iffy about the design. I like it a little bit more now that I see it in hand. But I've always been a big fan of this design of Skeletor. Or at least this look of Skeletor with the Origins line. The open mouth actually doesn't bother me at all, nor does the coloring that they applied to this face. Because again, it very much reminds me of that old retro line. The opening mouth does look good. Like I would imagine him just cackling, for example, laughing at some crapulence that he's actually just done on Eternia. I do like, again, the coloring that they did to his face. Kind of gives him a look that it's glowing. Again, I like the yellow against the backdrop of the green. The very bright red piercing eyes outlined in black. And again, they've even outlined those individual skeleton teeth. Or I guess what would have been the remains of his teeth. Very, very cool looking head sculpt. Like with the original line, though, the hood doesn't attach to the rest of the torso piece. It's always been like one floating piece. Now, obviously in the cartoon, it would be a continuation where the hood would attach to the rest of the armor. Not the case here with the original vintage line, and certainly not the case here with the Master of the Universe Origin line either. Love the head sculpt. Really happy with how that turned out. Of course, he does have the chest-torso piece armor. Again, I could go back to a talking point I already mentioned about the fact that they doesn't stay very well together, but knock on wood, it still has stayed class. I'm surprised, actually, that that is still staying attached the way that it is. Coloring on this guy, basically because he's just using plastic, it really has allowed for a very clean, finished figure. Mattel really is only just molding these in the plastic. In only a few cases, actually, they're going and painting parts to the figure, where most of it actually is just relying on the plastic. Because of that, the lighter, almost ice blues are very clean, because again, there's no paint that has to be applied to it. And even like the armor pieces, because there's no paint being applied there, there's no real mishaps happening here where paint is bleeding on to other parts. Again, you can see all the detail work with the crossbones. Of course, that bat that's molded onto the front of his torso piece there as well. Very nicely come together. Of course, he's got the little fins there on the sides. That's one thing that He-Man wouldn't have on his figure. He-Man would share, of course, the bicep, the shoulder, and the torso. This would be unique to Skeletor. In fact, as you can see here, let's bring He-Man in so you can see the difference. He-Man's forearm is also a lot more muscular, I would say, than Skeletor's. After all, it's He-Man. He's the most powerful man in the universe. As we get a little further down, of course, this is the part that covers over just the traditionally molded loincloth piece. The lower torso would find very many re-releases with the many Masters figures. And again, I would imagine as we're going to be looking at the rest of the Masters of the Universe Origins figures, you'll see very much of the same sort of calling card molds being carried over from one figure to the next. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Skeletor's feet and the fact that they're rather tiny. Although it was the same really not complaint necessarily, but it was certainly something I mentioned about He-Man, is he has these really tiny little feet. I don't know why Mattel is sculpting such small feet on these figures. Now, I understand, like, the original Masters of the Universe line did have generally tiny little tootsies. But I mean, Skeletor's feet seem so inadequately small when you look at the rest of the figure. It's enough to certainly keep the figure from falling over, and I suppose, if anything, you could use a pegged stand to attach to the peg holes in the undersides of his feet. But man, those are awfully small little feet. I know Skeletor doesn't want people drawing attention to it. I do like the detailing that they did certainly incorporate to the top half of his boots. And equally, he does have the little toe nails, I guess, sticking out at the very ends of it. But man, those are tiny little feet. All right, I'll stop drawing attention to Skeletor's feet. Let's draw a little attention to the figure's articulation. So his head is on a ball joint. Because of that, the head rotates all the way around. You can move the head down, you can move the head up, and you can also rock it back and forth, just like that, cackling all the way. You can also move Skeletor's arms out quite comfortably at a 90-degree angle bend. No problem whatsoever there. You can bring the arms forward, you can bring the arms back. You can swivel, not at the bicep necessarily, but you can swivel at the forearm, just like that. You can also rotate Skeletor's hands all the way around and hinge them also back and forth. While he doesn't have necessarily a ball joint in the upper torso, Mattel decided to go back to the basics. And even though he doesn't have the spring back feature like all the Masters figures generally had, Skeletor at least has the more traditional swivel joints, kind of a hark back to those original figures. As for his legs split out. You can do a full splits on Skeletor. And you can also bring his legs forward and back. That was a terrible impression of Skeletor. You can slightly rotate where the leg, where the thigh is attached via that ball joint. You can also move the leg back and forth on that lower leg. Now again, when it comes to these figures, all this time, all the while, you probably haven't even noticed it, I've had Skeletor's legs completely straight. If you want to go for the bunny ears retro look of this line, what you can do is just bring the legs slightly forward and then just bend the knee. It's really, when you think about it, it's so ridiculous of a marketing strategy to basically just say, like, this line of figures has a retro pose shape to it. So basically you just get the figures in a pose by only just bringing their legs forward and by only bending their knees. And then again, that's advertising. That's how you market and sell a line. You find the way that you can get the most out of a leg articulation by simply just selling it as you can get those figures in their original retro poses. That's basically what you can also do with Skeletor, which of course will shrink the size of the figure just slightly. And then of course, when it comes to his feet, his little tiny tootsies move back and forth. And you can also rotate them back and forth this way as well. A good looking Skeletor. I certainly get on board what they're trying to do with this Masters Universe Origin line, essentially giving us retro design figures. Now, of course, the categories of getting us He-Man figures in the past has been the original retro line. Then we got the He-Man Classics line, Masters of the Universe Classics, which started sort of as the next evolutionary step to the original He-Man Vintage line. And then before we knew it, we were knee-deep into cartoon-inspired figures. Where Mattel is going with this line is sort of in the middle. They're giving us retro figures, and just short of us just getting straight-out re-releases of those original figures, they're finding different ways to go about giving us brand new head sculpts, giving us similar design bodies, and giving us a lot more articulation than we had with that original toy line in the 80s. New for 2020, or in the case of this humbled reviewer, new for 2021, because now I'm finally getting my hands on these Masters of the Universe Origins figures. Took a little long, if you ask me. I know I was a little behind on the reviews of these. It wasn't for not trying, believe you me, between going around to local Walmarts and some Walmarts even out of my area to try to track these down and then to go online. I had no such luck trying to actually pick up the Masters of the Universe Origins figures. Luckily for me, the generosity of one very nice viewer, Sherwin, for picking these up, which I've mentioned already a couple of times in these reviews. If not for him, I would probably have a real tough time actually getting these. He was able to actually find these on Walmart.com, which you would almost even think Walmart.com would be able to deliver both to US and to Canada, but not the case, my friends. Walmart.com only delivers to addresses in the United States. If you are someone in Canada and you want to order from Walmart, you have to order from walmart.ca. And if you'll go on walmart.ca right now, what you won't find is Master Universe figures. You may find one or two. You may find one random Man-at-Arms, and you may find perhaps Battle Cat, but that's it. So it's been really difficult, I have to say. And that's this putting it lightly. It's been really difficult actually getting my hands on these Masters of the Universe figures. Now finally getting them in hand, I'm actually really glad that eventually I was able to get these one way, shape, or form, because I'm loving this line. This line is vintage and yet modernized. It somehow bridges the gap between the two. I can still recall when I got the Master Universe original He-Man Battle Cat, Skeletor, Panther sets. Now, you want to talk 80s. I was celebrating my birthday at Chuck E. Cheese and had just finished playing Dragon's Lair on arcade. I know between that, I've now just completely described the 80s and also dated myself by saying I played Dragon's Lair on the original arcade. But I still remember having those vintage figures, where I didn't benefit as much for Transformers. Usually I always got like the second characters. So instead of a Megatron, I got a Shockwave instead of an Optimus Prime. I would be the kid that got an Ultra Magnus. I was on the ball when it came to Masters of the Universe figures, getting all the main characters as they were coming out. And that's basically what we're getting here with the several lines that we've seen so far from Mattel. Mattel very nostalgically brings us these Masters of the Universe Origins figures, sort of a bridging gap between what we got with the Classics line and what we got with the original Retro line. These aren't quite the retro figures that we remember that we had as a kid, but they're almost the next best thing, being the fact that they have some extra posability where it counts to put them in those crouching vintage poses. Mattel, you marketing geniuses, being able to actually brand the articulation on the legs of these figures as being able to put them in their retro poses. Fine work. I tip my virtual hat to you. Have you had luck picking this line up for yourself? Let me know down below in the comments section. And again, I know I've already said this already, but thank you to Sherwin, who took the time to pick these up and send these my way. If you would like to check out Sherwin's work over on Instagram, feel free to check out Shell Pose, especially if you're a fan of NECA figures and specifically Ninja Turtles. He does some fantastic work with his camera. You definitely have to check out those photos. If you're also new to this channel and you're liking all the content you're seeing, don't mind the fact that we're a little behind when it comes to having a look at Master of the Universe Origins figures. Thank you for that, by the way. Make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. New member of the mob. Help yourself to a Rice Krispie treat. I have the snack table fully stocked and ready to go. And also make sure that you hit that bell notification. That's your way of telling not only yourself as a reminder, but also telling YouTube that you want those friendly reminders of when new videos pop up. And just know, Monday to Friday, 12 p.m. and 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll have new videos popping up. Not only Masters of the Universe variety, but a whole variety of other things as well. A whole smorgasbord, a buffet table, which I guess doesn't really exist right now. I don't think buffets are really happening because of you know what. But there's definitely lots more stuff coming your way, guys. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.